Okay, Brad, we're back. We've been all over the states this evening. I mean, Gordy must be going to get us some frequent flyer miles. I mean, you know, he sent us on a goose chase all over the place. We're now in just north of Dallas, Texas, with Duane. So, I think he should double our pay for tonight.
Well, if he doesn't double our pay, I just wish you'd get us better seats in this plane, because these seats aren't comfortable.
I know. He always sends us cattle class. I reckon we've earned at least economy, premium economy. You know, like. So anyway, just a quick note: we're now streaming on YouTube through the wonders of modern technology and being able to get the electrons to flow on the other side of the wire in Australia. We've managed to do a stream to Facebook and to YouTube at the same time. So everybody out there, if you're having problems with Facebook, because it can be a bit of a problematic platform, hop on over to YouTube. So Brad, you got a community service announcement as well, haven't you?
Yeah, that's right. While we're up with technology, we're also running a virtual door prize. So to jump in and grab an entry in that, all you've got to do is put a post up on Facebook or Instagram, hashtag NMRAx, and you'll go into the draw for a $50 certificate at Mini Prints, and they've got some really great details for your home layout. I've seen Martin's already been madly on his phone searching the website, so I dare say there'll be some things showing up shortly in the mail for him. But without any further ado, our next clinician is in. By day, he helps keep your credit card transactions safe. He's an AP chair, division director, and MMR 391. Welcome, Duane. Over to you.
Thank you, sir. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. I'm going to kick off my slide presentation here. All right. I like to call this clinic, if it ain't dirty, it ain't done. This particular class is not your typical weathering clinic where I'm going to talk about how to do it. I'm going to talk more about where and why to do it. One of the things that I've found, and I certainly mean no insult to anybody watching this, I've found that over time, and I've learned this one the hard way, that a lot of us tend to weather incorrectly in a few places. It's all about context, and I cover this in several different types of clinics, but we're really going to go over this today. What is weathering and why should I bother? And it's part of this attention to detail, and it really is what separates our scale models from being a toy. And one of the things that I found that I really thought was a really spot on was a comment from a very famous model railroader from back in the day named Frank Ellison, where he once said, the layout is our stage and our trains are the actors on that stage, and weathering is our actors' makeup. And that's very true. So what we're going to cover today is different ways that you can go about modeling and weathering your models and really make them stand out and stand up above the rest. So we're going to break this into a few categories. I'm going to quickly cover some philosophy, and then we're going to break it down by rolling stock, locomotives, structures, and finally scenes themselves. So for philosophy, it's pretty straightforward. What should I weather? All of it. Everything from the fascia to the backdrop should have some semblance of weathering on it. It doesn't have to be filthy, grimy, and dirty. The cars don't have to be only held together by the coat of paint, but they do need to look lived in. It's pretty simple. We live in a really dirty world, and our models need to reflect that. They need to look like they've been outside and that they've been in the rain and in the snow and whatever else environment that your railroad may run through. What does a car haul? Can it be spilled? Where does it haul it? All of these things go into the impact on our rolling stock and our structures. All kinds of things coat to, cover, stick to, land on, and are spilled on our rolling stock. And all of this kind of boils into what I like to refer to as the 5 keys to good weathering. And you keep these 5 things in mind: grease, grime, dust, rust, and mud. All of that will combine together, and we're going to talk about this off and on throughout the clinic. So jumping right into rolling stock, our freight cars are very dirty. They get beat up and banged up. They're rusty. They're muddy. All these things, come into play. And again, it's those 5 keys that I talked about. The other things to keep in mind are faded lettering. This is if you take two things out of this clinic, this one right here is number one, and we'll talk about this more a little bit later, but faded lettering and soot on your roofs. Car bodies, the sides and the ends and everything, the lettering will look faded over time, and it'll give the appearance that the car has been in service. Too often we'll grab a car, whether it's an old Athearn Blue Box or an AccuRail or whatever the latest, greatest thing is with all the greatest details, and it may look absolutely immaculate. And more often than not, a guy will come home, pull this out of the box, and go straight to his box of magic tricks and start making it look dirty. And you end up with a car that looks like it's, been out on the line for 10, 15, 20 years, but the lettering underneath all of those 5 keys looks brand new. That lettering fades, it chips, it gets beat up just like the rest of the car. So it's really important that you fade the lettering first, and we'll go over that here in a little bit. And here's a good example. This is a high side gondola that I built a number of years ago. I do Colorado narrow gauge out in the southwestern corner of the state. I understand for HO3 guys that's terribly original, but we're a sister railroad to the Rio Grande Southern, and we're very tied to the RGS. So even though we're a freelance, we're very tied to the prototype. So in this particular case, all I did with this particular car is to take the boxcar red that I used to paint the outside of the car, and I mixed it down to a very, very thin wash, and I just shot a coat of that all the way around the car, around the decals, and it does a couple things. It'll help hide your decal film if there is any still showing, and it will fade that lettering into the background. Now, what you have to be very careful about if you operate your railroad is not to overdo it, and this is why I go to very, very thin washes. You can always layer it up, but you can't take it back. So be very careful around your car numbers so that you don't cover them up if you're in operations. If you do what the railroad does. Mask off a little rectangle around it, shoot a fresh coat of paint over it, layer on some new numbers. That will also help tell a story, and that's part of what our weathering is here to do, is tell that story of time. Undercarriages of cars, this is where a lot of these 5 keys are going to come into place. Trucks and couplers, don't forget those as well. Those are easily done. All the new chalks and powders that are out there make this a very easy task to do, and it won't hurt the operation of the freight car itself. But they do get very dirty and very rusty. Passenger trucks don't get as dirty, and because they typically keep those clean. Passenger cars and reefers, reefers being in food service, railroad did try to keep those clean a little bit, but passenger cars especially. Nobody wants a customer climbing in and out of a filthy coach. You want to put your best foot forward. Everything that's customer facing should look a little better than the rest of the road. Now, general principles for rolling stock. Again, we're covering the same 5 keys. I prefer to use paint for most of it. However, with a lot of the newer weathering powders, AIM and Bragdon, things like that, Prismacolored colored pencils, AK Interactive, who primarily cater to the military modelers, tank guys and things, they have a wonderful new set of weathering pencils. And it's a watercolor based, so you can use them like you would a regular colored pencil for doing streaks and things, but you can also get them wet and then do wet looking stains and things like that. Different types of stains. Alcohol and India ink is a go-to for a lot of us, has been for decades. I would caution newer guys, if you're not aware, a lot of people will tend to want to go, well, I've got some shoe dye, a leather dye, I'll use that. Black leather dye in almost every instance is really a very, very dark blue. And under certain types of lights and usually fluorescence, that black stain will no longer be black, but kind of a weird blue to purplish hue. And it will really mess up a good paint job. So one thing to keep in mind, the one that I know of is USMC black. It has nothing to do with the U.S. Marine Corps, but that's a good way to help remember it. But that black is actually black, so you can use it. But plain old India ink is fairly easy to find from any art supply, and mix up several different shades of it, several different pints of alcohol. If you do a lot of wooden modeling, wood freight cars, wooden structures, try to get the highest alcohol content you can in your rubbing alcohol. More alcohol means less water, and less water means more warping, and it will dry faster. So mix you up several colors, dip a few blocks in, and make yourself what we call a storyboard. So you glue these things out to a piece of styrene or a sheet of paper or foam core board, whatever, and then write the recipe next to it. So this is 1 teaspoon of alcohol to a pint or whatever. And you can use that then as a reference when you're building your model. How dirty do I want this thing to be? Now, back into our overall weathering. when you've got a freight car bottom, believe it or not, they actually get muddy. And I'm not talking, monster truck, grave digger kind of dirty. We're not taking this thing out four-wheeling, but right-of-ways, and especially in lesser railroads, where you're not talking a good class one, a little bit of the right-of-way can get washed out from time to time. A bit of a mud puddle can develop underneath the track. And as the weight of the freight car goes over that particular rail, it will push it down into it very suddenly, and this causes a splash up underneath the car. And it can come up the car sides. It's something you want to do as a very subtle effect. There are a lot of old techniques. Remember guys talking about dipping an old toothbrush into it and dragging their thumb across it. And this will throw some very large droplets of paint up the car. You want to be very careful to do it from the bottom up whenever you're doing anything, even airbrushing it, because you want these things to move in an upward fashion, since that's the direction that it's coming from. But typically for HO and in scale, these drops are just too big. You may have some instances where you may need it, but again, very, very sparingly. But up underneath the car, your stains, powder washes, anything that's metal obviously can have a little rust spots here and there as paint flakes off, as it will do as the car is being used. Bragdon powders are a good way to go, or the AIM powders, or whichever weathering powder you tend to like. These are much better than the old pastel chalks that we used to use, because they actually have an adhesive quality to them. So the old ones, you would over weather it and you'd seal it with a dull coat, and a lot of that finish would melt away. And it took years of practice to get good at knowing when to stop and know what you're going to get, what you expect at the end. The Bragdon powders and the AIM powders don't work that way. I mean, the old ones, the harder you rub them, the more they would blend and the more they would erase. These, the harder you rub them, the better they stay. And you have to be very, very, use them very sparingly. But I use them around my trucks, on the wheel faces, all the brake gear, things like that. A little mist of grimy black here and there, just to help, kind of cover some of the shadows and things. All this stuff is tried to represent various parts and pieces of your weathering, obviously. And then I finish that off with a coat of dust. Now, with Flocoil going away, or having been gone away, there's other options for dust. And in some cases, if it's something I'm not touching. Now, rolling stock is a little different, because, you'll have the occasional derailment. You may be taking it to a club or to a friend's layout, but they get handled. So I typically like to do it on rolling stock with paint. Structures, I'll actually use real dirt, but on a freight car, I try to do as much paint as I can, just because of the handling part. Now, for the sides and the tops of the cars, the first thing we want to do is mist in our coat of paint to fade that lettering back into the background a little bit. And then we want to give some thought to, again, where is it running, what's it running through, as to what may come down the sides of the car and things like that. But again, you're dealing with more of a vertical kind of a weathering technique, because everything's going to be running down the car. Gravity is just funny that way. Even with the car moving down the line, you may get a little bit of a drift from one side to the other, but typically all those stains and things are going to run straight down the car. Chalks work really well for this. The new watercolor pencils I found work really, really well for it, depending on the kind of stain you're looking for. But something to keep in mind on all the roofs of your stock cars and your structures and things are the type of leftovers from our locomotives. What kind of cinders are left if you're running steam, things like that. That typically is something that gets overlooked. And roof detail is by far the most important thing to cover on your railroad, because in almost all cases, unless you've got a double deck layout where you've got something a little more eye level, most of the time we're looking down onto our layouts. So the roofs of buildings should have more detail. Roofs of our cars should have as much detail as we can. So we're looking at different things there to include your different soot buildup or cinders or whatever. And these can be done fairly easily. You want to add a little bit of rust here and there, a little bit of dry brushing, but everything, again, is on a vertical surface. So you always want to use upstrokes as you're adding these things. If you're kicking it up from the bottom, if you're looking at something that the rain may wash down, then you want to use a downstroke. But remember that the bottom of any wall is going to stay wetter longer. And this really impacts structures more than it does freight cars, but you're going to get more buildup at the bottom of a car than you will at the top. Now, this is a good example of using pencils for colored weather, or for doing weathering. Using the colored pencils from Prismacolor is the ones I used on this car. Other than alcohol and India ink and the Bragdon powders on the wheels themselves and the couplers, the car itself, all of that weathering on the outside is done with Prismacolored colored pencils. You can get them very sharp. You can get them down in all the little nooks and crannies. You can get really fine detail with them. You can draw lines in there like the paint is peeling. You can get them really sharp and then turn it up on its side, and you can drag it, back and forth or up and down depending on the streak you're trying to get, and use the larger piece of the exposed material or lead, as we think of it in a pencil, and you can get some really, really nice effects with it. It takes just a little bit of learning curve, but it's not very bad. Now, stock cars are a unique car because of what they haul. Most of the time, you're talking larger animals, cows, horses, things like that. There are specialty cars where they have a second deck when you're talking about hauling sheep or pigs, things to that effect. But they have a stain that is very unique to what they haul. Whenever you load animals into a stock car, they put down some hay and they put down a coat of lime onto the floor. And when the animals are offloaded, all of this gets pressure washed out the side, and that lime will leave this whitish haze around the side sills of the car. And if it's a double deck, you'll see a similar stain about halfway up the car. And this is very, very simple to do. Again, it's great with chalks. There's what they call, I think it's mortar is the color they call it, from Bragdon. Does a very, very nice job of this. And it's because it's already a little bit of grayish color for the mortar, but it's also a little darker than white. So it kind of gives it a bit of a lime stain, but aged as well. So that's a really, really nice effect. Again, we talked about the different types of soot and cinders and that kind of buildup, and that's really, really simple to do as well. Something like a Vallejo flat varnish, you can take a little bit of that on a brush and paint it around any ribs on the roof or up around the edges of the roof walks and things like that. And then a little bit of artist graphite, take a fine piece of sandpaper and sand a little bit of that down into a pile, and you can take some of that and put it into that wet paint and use that not only as a flattening agent, but as a glue or adhesive. And this will help hold all that in place. And believe it or not, a freight car rolling down the rails, even though it's shaking back and forth and the wind's blowing across it, it actually will build up a fairly respectable amount of cinders up on a roof. And especially anything that's parked will build, and the trains are going by it all the time, will actually build up a good pile of them relatively quickly. So it's a simple effect, but it's very dramatic. It can be overdone, so be very careful with it, but play around with it. Find something that you like. It is a really neat effect, and it's not done by many people, and it's something that'll help set your stuff apart. Talking about that stain here, this is a friend of mine's layout, and he's got an SN3 layout, and you can see this haze across the bottom of the car right here, and all of that was done with an airbrush. Mark had a friend of his named Steve Amatrano actually painted that with an airbrush, but it can be done with the chalks as well. But it's a really nice effect. It really makes them look lived in. Again, you probably seen it in previous slides, harping on it a lot. Rust any of the metal parts, brake wheels, stovepipes, even on passenger cars, especially cabooses. You add a little bit of rust before the soot. Typically, the rust is going to be behind everything else that's landed on it and making it dirty. So you kind of have to think logically about what got piled on it in what order. So it's wood, then paint, then lettering paint, and then everything else that gets stacked up on top of it. So in this case, the rust is going to happen in the background. The soot's going to be on the top. So tank cars are another one where we have to think about, what gets spilled on it. Covered hoppers for the more modern modelers, they have a bit of a well in the top of it, which holds liquids. If it's hauling grain, that grain stays wet for a really long time and causes that top to rust out. And ones that haul chemicals are even worse, because depending on what chemical it is, that mixture of water can get that to turn caustic, and it can really start eating away at the paint job on the tops of these cars. And it requires, the same rusting effect, but maybe just a little bit more of it. And I always encourage anybody on anything that you're going to be handling a lot, and this is really where rolling stock and locomotives are really the important part, is always seal it with a little bit of dull coat after you're done. Use the dull coat of your choice. If you want to mix it and shoot it out of an airbrush, great. If you like Tamiya or Tamiya, however you want to pronounce it, better than you like the Tester's rattle can, great, go with that. Any rattle can, though, I would suggest that you soak the can itself in some warm water for 5 to 10 minutes to help warm the paint up a little bit. And anything you shoot, whether it be a color coat or especially a clear coat for dulling out a finish, be very careful about shooting it in a very humid environment, because any moisture that paint traps between the paint surface that seals and the model will cause what they call blushing, where it will turn a bit of white. Shooting over alcohol and India ink, if it's still wet at all, can cause the same kind of effect. So you have to be a little careful, make sure everything is very, very dry, but you do want to seal it just to prevent everything from getting rubbed off over time. Now, see, this is a case of for the modern guys, and again, talking about the covered hoppers. Look at the rust on the top of this car and how these streaks run down, and they're even intervals, so that's got to be a seam. You've got another seam across here where the angle changes. That is super easy to do. You can mask it off and airbrush it if you really wanted to get that technical with it. But again, those colored pencils are great for effects like this. You've also got graffiti to worry about. Now, being a narrow gauge guy and modeling back in the 50s, I don't have as much of this to worry about as the modern guys do. But there are a lot of good artwork decals out there that you can get with some of the newer printers, like the one Micromark has been selling that will allow you to print in white. You can go out to the internet, find different pieces of artwork, manipulate that around however you want to, and actually use real art, graffiti artists' work, and put those onto your cars as decals. I know a lot of Class A railroads, even that high, I've reached out and basically said that unless it covers the car number, they're going to stop painting over it. At this point, it's another layer of protective paint, so you're going to see graffiti on top of graffiti. So stacking decals may become something we may look at doing over time. Put one on, fade it out, beat it up, rust it up, or whatever, and then lay another decal over it. Again, it's look at the prototype, spend some time looking at your favorite browser and looking through pictures of what's out there and giving you some ideas. Now, locomotives, as we switch gears here, are especially steam. These are very, very dirty machines by nature. They create most of the weathering effects that we're going to see, not only on our rolling stock and our locomotives themselves, but as well as the buildings that surround the layout. In the very early days, back in the 1800s, early 1900s, a crew was assigned to a particular engine. And, that's when you saw the engines and they had pinstripes and all this pretty shiny brass. And it became a point of pride that mine is cleaner than yours is. And crews would, kind of challenge themselves back and forth between each other to make sure that mine runs better and it runs cleaner and all this. And when the railroads figured out it was better to have whatever crew was available, take whatever engine was available, that went out the window. Keeping a locomotive clean, there just wasn't any point in it anymore. So over time, they just got dirtier and dirtier and dirtier. Now, I will make a quick caveat to this again, like I mentioned before. If it's meant to haul passengers, they would typically try to keep it clean. And they may even be painted differently than a freight engine will, depending on your railroad. So something else to keep in mind. Now, what fuel your engines burn will also impact the weathering. Oil burning locomotives won't leave cinders on car roofs, for example. Wood burners will leave a different type of effect on the roof than coal burning will. So it's all about knowing what you're working with. The soot ends up everywhere. Coal or wood fired roofs of buildings where it's right next to the railroad will have piles of these cinders on top of them. Cars that are parked next to the right-of-way will, because again, it's Newton's law. What goes up must come down. So sides of the smoke box, everything of these on locomotives runs down those boiler jackets down either side, and it creates a bit of a streaky, powdery looking finish when it's all said and done. Oil burners will tend to have a bit of an oily color to that, a little bit of brown, a little bit of black kind of coloring, and all of this streaks down the sides. This is a shot, and I'm hope this shows up well on the screen here. This is one of my very favorite locomotives, and hopefully maybe later this year she'll be under steam again. And I bring this one up as a demonstration. Along here, and I hope you can see my mouse, this is an extra air tank along the back and an air line that runs down forward and then over here to the air pump. This is a great demarcation line when you're weathering. And the reason for this is two things. The lettering used on the side of the locomotive over time will oxidize. And what will happen during rain and things is it will take that oxidation and start washing it down the side of the tender. So you can take a little bit of white powder, take your finger and drag it, put a little bit of white powder on the lettering itself, and then drag it down. It's very, very subtle. You don't have to get overdone with it. But where it hits the spot where the tender fuel area stops, This is the deck where they actually put the water into the tender. When they're putting water in this, they're not using a measuring cup. They're not getting a very precise pour. They're not using a garden hose. They've got this huge funnel that it's coming out of your tank or out of your ground mount, and this is pouring in hundreds of gallons at a time, and it's not an exact science. And not only that, in talking with several firemen, they want it to overflow. And the reason for this is it washes those cinders and any small pieces of coal or whatever that may have fallen over the back, and it washes that deck off, and it keeps things from being slick up there for if the crew is walking around back there, and it keeps somebody from falling off the side. But what happens when they wash this off is that water goes up and over the edges and then down the sides of the tender. So this area here won't show the same haze as this because it's getting wet more often, and it's washing that oxidation all the way off the locomotive as opposed to just washing it down the edge just a little bit. So it's something to keep in mind that there's going to be a line in your weathering on a tender that it gets different than it will be going forward. Again, staying with steam locomotives, it's like a boxcar, a lot of the same principles, cinders, soot, just like we talked about. However, calcium deposits are an interesting one. If your railroad is running a little more backwoods, a little more mom and pop, maybe things aren't being maintenance quite the same you would if you were, modeling the Santa Fe or something like that. They'll tend to spring a leak every once in a while along different steam lines. And typically, depending on where you are in the country or in the nation in this case, you may have harder water or softer water. There may be different minerals in the water, and this can tend to leave, calcium deposits and things like that. And these are really easy to do too. You can take a little bit of distilled water on a paintbrush and just touch it along the line where you want this leak to have appeared. Take you a little bit of off-white paint and get just the tip of it into the brush, and then drop that into that water and let the capillary action and gravity drag that down. And when you first do that, you'll probably use my name in vain because it is very garish up front, but then come back in, weather it back in, and it becomes a very subtle effect, but you instantly, your eye sees it and goes, oh, there's, they've had a little bit of maintenance issue there kind of thing. It's a neat little effect, and you don't need to do it everywhere. I mean, one, maybe two locomotives on the entire layout and in one spot on those locomotives. If you see it everywhere, you're telling the same story all the time. If you do it once, that locomotive and that locomotive alone needs to get into the shop at some point. So it gets back into that storytelling. I talk a lot in my clinics about, a lot of what we do is smoke and mirrors. If you overdo it, the eye gets used to it, and then it becomes less of an interesting detail. So one locomotive. Again, everything on it, water washes everything down. And I know I'm saying this a lot, but it's very, very important because you'll see a lot of guys will go in there and start doing a lot of side-to-side motions when they start weathering things down, and it just leaves the wrong effect. Again, faded lettering, always with the faded lettering. It's a very important thing, and it so often gets overlooked. Lots and lots of dry brushing, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, but for the newer modelers online today, you're going to take your paintbrush, you're going to get it just the tips of it into the paint. You're going to wipe most of that off on a paper towel or on the edge of your palette or whatever, and the whole idea is you want that paintbrush to be almost dry, and this is for streaking kind of effects. So again, very up and down kind of motions, and it will help you with certain types of effects. So you have to kind of play around with it and see, do I like it with a chalk? Do I like it with a paintbrush? Do I like it with an airbrush? Try all of them until I'm trying to get, this kind of effect. Try all three of them until you find the one you like the best. Even some stains. Hunterline makes a great, wonderful line of stains in all sorts of different colors, and those can help you out in all sorts of different applications for making any kind of wet-looking stain, help it run all over. Now, diesel locomotives are going to be different, mainly because of what they haul, or the fuel they're using, I'm sorry. It's a little different effect because you don't have the cinders. You don't have that washback of that kind of thing, but you will have an oily petrol kind of effect. And one of the things I found with that is it's best to get that out of an airbrush. Typically, I like to put my paint in a little on the thick side, sometimes even straight, crank up the air pressure on the brush a little bit, and then shoot it from a bit of a distance so that the paint is almost dry when it lands on the model. It creates a much different effect. It gives it a little more of a hazy look, a more scattered look. There's a lot of different ways to get that. I know military guys tend to like to take a little bit of foam, like a sponge, and pull that out at really regular little chunks, and using almost a dry brush effect like that can get a similar kind of effect. Bragdon makes a exhausty kind of colored weathering powder, and a couple of other companies. Tamiya makes one too for doing the jet engine exhaust. Those things can be used as well, depending on how dirty you want your locomotive to be. Now we get into structures. Mother Nature's effects, you've always got to kind of keep in mind. So we start off with the basic one that most of us see unless you're in a desert. And even then you'll see it every once in a while, but rain. This causes most of the staining that we're going to see on a roof. And again, the bottom stays wetter longer, especially if it's in contact with the ground itself. If it's, your foundation is kind of buried or whatever. If you work in an area that, or model in an area where you're in a more northern climate where you get a lot of snow, for example, snow stays piled up around the bottom of the building, so that bottom of the wall is going to stay wetter longer. It will start rotting first. It will start showing the effects of weathering much more than the top will. Now, I mentioned before, there were two things I hope you take out of this clinic today. Number two, a lot of people will take a building and they start weathering it, and they go at the bottom and they weather all the way to the top. There are few cases, if you've got a building up against the rail line where a steam engine's going by it and that smoky exhaust is going up and rolling underneath the eave of the building and out, then yes, weather it all the way up. Other than that, the eave of the building is going to protect the top foot to foot and a half of that wall. I've got pictures that I've taken out of this deck for time, but I've got pictures of barns that I've seen over the years in various parts of the country where the top 18 inches or so of the wall looks brand new. It looks like they painted it yesterday. But once you get out from underneath the protection of that eave where the sun can get on it and the rain can get on it, there's next to no paint left on the building at all. And it's very dramatic when you start making that change and weathering your buildings that way. And it's really neat what that does to help your eye tell your brain that this looks dirty, that looks lived in, and it fills in some gaps that the back of your brain might be missing otherwise. Any exposed metal, again, rust. It doesn't have to be overdone, and it doesn't have to be completely rusty. Just little bitty spots here and there. Those colored weathering pencils are great for things like that, but just a little bit of detail to help break up the monotony, the monochromaticness of a single color of paint. Dust and grime, you can never go wrong with that. Again, it shows that it's lived in. It shows it's been out there. A little bit over the entire structure, but the bottom of the wall again, if you live in a house where you have neighbors fairly close, and especially if you live close enough that the sun can't get in it and you've got dirt in between your houses, if you go out and you look at in the side yard, look at the walls on your house, chances are maybe as high as 2.5 feet, but typically a little bit lower than that, there'll be a little bit of a haze that's the same color as the dirt in your side yard. And what that is the rain hitting that dirt and splattering it up onto the side of the house. And this is easily done with an airbrush. It's easily done with any dust colored powders. Pan pastels are another biggie that have come onto our hobby in the last few years. And these are really, really nice for doing large surfaces. So dusting like this would be a great application for pan pastels. Black stains, things like that. Again, alcohol and India ink. I really like that combination. It sinks into all the nooks and crannies. It creates the shadows. It creates depth. And it needs to be on everything. I mean, like, again, from fascia to backdrop. Our people typically are too clean. Our automobiles are way too clean. Cars running down the road typically look cleaner than things that are sitting in a car lot. They really could be dirtied up, and it's a fairly simple task to do. Again, the soot stains on buildings that we talked about, all of these things really add a lot of extra detail. What kind of structure is it? Is it a manufacturing plant? What are they loading and unloading out of our rolling stock? A railroad doesn't very carefully pick something up off a flat car, lift it up in the air so that it's clear of everything, very carefully rotate it, and very daintily sit it down on a loading dock. They reach up, they grab a hold of it, they drag it off the car, which tears up the deck of the flat car. They drag it onto the dock of whatever the building is, which helps tear it up and gouge it and whatever else. They leave it, they're done, they're out. And it's just the fact of the matter of the way people work. And these kinds of impacts can be taught, or can be represented in weathering. So you can go in and you can beat up the edges of the boards a little bit and ingrain in grain on boards, especially on flat carb decks and loading docks. The in grain of the wood will suck up moisture and it rots there first. A sharp little tool. I use a lot of negative tweezers in my modeling, and I got a couple of them that I have literally sanded into a very fine point, and I'll take those and pick at it. Dental picks work great for this too. Eat the edges up of the boards and really tear out chunks of it is really what you're trying to do. And in scale, you got to be careful with this because it's harder to do because you'll pull great big chunks out of it. And you're working in a smaller environment. This needs to be a little more subtle. So maybe an X-Acto would work for this. But you want the edges of the boards to look a little more beat up, and then a slightly darker color of stain on the edges there into that in grain. Let it suck up, and wherever it stops, let it stop. And then the rest of it will be a slightly different color. One of the things I would caution against, and it's become very, very popular in the last couple of decades, is you'll see this in a lot of craftsman kits. Take all the wood for your structure, put a third of it in this color of stain, put a third of it in that color of stain, put another third in the last bucket, and each one of them is progressively darker. Take that, mix them all together, throw it in a pile, and just start putting boards on. And you will find some cases where you will find this in the prototype, but it is really exceedingly rare. And the reason for this is all these boards were put on at the exact same time. They're all from the same source. They're all the same species of wood. So they all typically weather the same way. So because they've all been out there for 8 years, 27 days, and 3 hours, they're all going to be roughly the same color, whether that be a gray like we have here in Texas because we're a lower level, there's a little more oxidation going on, whether it's a brown because you're up in Colorado and there's less oxygen, so the weathering effect of that is a little bit different, turns yellows and browns. Whatever your coloring effect is, typically will be the same color on all of those boards. Now, what you can do if you want that opposite effect is use a new board. If it's a privacy fence, for example, around a yard, they've lost a board, they put on a new one new one, or maybe 3, or worst case 5. Always work in odd numbers, and this is more in detailing than it is in weathering, but odd numbers break up the symmetry and it will help it look real. Even numbers, your mind will see that, and it just, there's something wrong with it, and it eats at the back of your brain a little bit, where the odd number will help solve that. A breakup in that color. If that's what you're going for, maybe try that effect as opposed to the zebra stripe effect you get with different colors. Nail holes are another biggie that a lot of guys tend to like, and I've got arguments against that one too, but it is a nice effect when used properly in the right conditions. It's all about what you want to do. So again, liquid stains, these are going to run all over the place. So what does the manufacturing build? Are they bringing in liquids to make, say, a glue? Can that be spilled on the loading dock because they rupture a can of something or whatever? That's a really important thing to think about when you're working through and deciding what kind of effects you're going to have. Again, the alcohol stains are great for water stains and different chemical stains and things to that effect. Real dirt, whether you get it out of your yard or, in my case, I actually have dirt from Colorado that I use. I sift it down. I've got a set of geology sieves that I shake it all down through, and then I sort it out by different grades. And the bottom canister of that is dust. I mean, one good sneeze, you're going to empty the whole thing dust. And I use that when I'm weathering on buildings and things because it matches the dirt I'm going to be using around the layout, and it helps tie the structures to the ground that it's living in. And it's important that you put your structures down and put the scenery up to it so that you don't get the effect of the house in The Wizard of Oz being dropped on the Wicked Witch. We jokingly in the North Texas area, we kind of refer to this as the Dorothy effect. You want your buildings to look in the ground, not on the ground. So when we weather this thing up, or when you scenic it up, and then you tie your weathering into that, it helps the building look planted into the earth that it lives in. And it's very, very subtle, but it really is a dramatic effect. Any building with a painted surface, you can get peeling paint effects. Again, colored pencils are great for this. They're in larger scales. There's different availability of materials for you. Krylon, Rust-Oleum both make textured spray paints. You can get some of those for painting brick structures, for example, that will actually give it a little bit of tooth in the finish. And it's a really nice effect. There's a crackling medium here I've mentioned at the bottom of the slide from Deco Art. It's an acrylic. You paint this on, you paint your color coat over it, and then it starts to crack and peel. It's a little large for HO. For S, it's not too bad, and for O, it is spectacular, and it really is a nice effect. Again, preaching again, the alcohol stains go everywhere, but people in sidewalks, vehicles, all of this stuff it doesn't have to be a lot. just a little bit because it helps set shadows in your figures. It helps set shadows in the sidewalks. Cars leave oil on the streets. Chalks do a really great effect for that. They're easy to manipulate, move around, streak around and things. Seal them down when you're done, just not when your buildings are already on there. Do this before you plant your structures. Otherwise, you have to mask off your streets. Junk. Think of all the things that are around your buildings. Why is it there? What's growing around it? What needs to be rusted? What doesn't? What's it exposed to? Now, this is not a very good picture. I took this one several years ago before I knew which end of a camera to point where. But again, you see the streaks of the oil of cars passing up and down the roads, the expansion joints, the cracks that have been tarred over. Your vehicles. This is another good one, and it's more of a detail than it is weathering, but I really wanted to throw this slide in. License plates can help set an era and a location. Wheels on the vehicles are all round, yet if you look at your car, it's actually flat on the bottom because it's squatting due to the weight. File those flat. I even go so far as to take a little bit of Aleene's tacky glue, put a little bead around the bottom of the tire, and then paint that back into the tire to give it a little bit of squat so it looks like it's heavier. Mask off your windshield, and you can do this easily and put a little bit of dirt across the windshield and peel the mask back off, and it'll look like the windshield wipers have been cleaning the window. Dull coat the vehicle. Nothing should look like it's very fresh and clean and shiny. When you put a figure in, and please, dear God, put figures in your cars. There's nothing creepier than seeing a truck going down the road and nobody's in it. Passenger cars the same way. It's really sad. It's a ghost town. But it takes a little bit of effort to take a car to car, and I realize this, but it really is a nice effect. But while you're in there, roll the window down, roll it halfway down, part the way down, whatever. It makes the vehicles different. It'll make them all unique. Now, if you've seen the old Heinz pickle factory, it's been made by every manufacturer known to man, and it's been out since probably the late 50s, early 60s. I bought one of those, and I used it basically as a set of plans, and I scratch built it. And here you can see some of the effects of powder weathering, stain weathering, around all the detail parts and everything that's laying around it, and try to give it a little more of a lived-in look. This right here is a detail I wanted to point out. I got this from my father. I'm actually the first generation in 4 not to work for a railroad. All my family worked for the Frisco for many, many years. My dad worked for him for 14 or 15 years before he lost his mind and got into IT. And one of the things that he told me was anywhere they would spot a car, you would usually find a stash of small logs, little blocks of wood, broken pallet skids, whatever, and you chalk the wheels of a freight car with it because you never trust the brakes to hold it in place. So a little stash like this where you've got just a little pile of wood in here, just 1 or 2 pieces, very nice little scenic effect. This was one of my first attempts at fading a sign, and I would most certainly do it differently now than I did back in the 90s, but this will give you an idea of kind of the effect I'm talking about, where you want to try to make that lettering look like it's just as old as the rest of the paint job. Here's your detail parts. Again, it's what is it, where is it, why is it there? You really want to drive yourself insane sometimes, spend a weekend scratch building these little wooden skids. You will question your sanity after you make the first 2 or 3 of those, but it is really nice to have some out of wood because they do affect, take the stains and the effects of time and weathering better than trying to make a plastic one look like wood, my opinion. But I like the effects of it. Here you've got a guy standing up on the top of a ladder, obviously ignoring that little sticker on the top that says not to use that as a step. Where's OSHA when you need them? But again, look how dusty and dirty the truck is. It doesn't have a lot of shine. It doesn't look brand new. It shows the effect that it's been driving around on a dirt road. Your rusty roof's been all eat up. He's looking at trying to do the repair, I guess. Now, here's a couple of quick pictures I'll kind of close with. This is part of the Elk Canyon and Western, our narrow gauge group. We recently sold this layout to the gentleman who owns Division Point. This was an SN3, but you can see all the details and the effects of the weathering. This is a mine I built for one of our club members. This took a best in show at an LSR convention and took a first place at the National Narrow Gauge Convention in Denver a few years ago. All of this is made out of wooden coffee stirring sticks and stained with a couple of different shades of hunter line stains. But you can see here how it's darker at the bottom than it is up here and how the effects are varied. And you can get this with a paintbrush. You can do it by dipping it and soaking it, however you want to do it. But there's a lot of different techniques that you can play around with, just different shades of stains. And it really is a dramatic impact on how it takes its color. And each technique makes it take that wood color a little bit differently. And there she is installed. When you get down to weathering, and I'll close with this, a little logic goes a long way. Pay attention to how it looks in real life. Use your favorite browser. Go look up pictures. Go look at it for real if you can. It's that necessary step that if you take that and you reflect that in your models, yours will stand out above the rest. And the number one thing, remember, it's your railroad. Your railroad, your rules. If somebody else doesn't like what you've done, too bad. They don't have to make them, you don't have to make them happy. This is all about us having some fun and relieving a little stress from the world and coming up with something that we like. And bottle it to your taste and stop. We're doing this to have some fun. Don't let anything else get to you. And I'll open it up for questions.
Great. Thanks, Duane. Like you said, yeah, we're in it for fun, and tell you the truth, I'm enjoying all these clinks we've got coming through. We've got a few questions out there in Facebook and YouTube. Ken asked, what kind of residue would be left behind on the roof of a freight car that's typically been pulled behind a oil-burning steam locomotive?
Yeah, you'll get kind of the similar effect of what you get with a diesel. I like to do that with the same technique. It's a color kind of thing. You want to look around for something that's really oily. I know a lot of modelers have really started shying away from craft paints like these, but there is a color over there that one of the manufacturers, I believe it's Americana, makes called Off Black. And it's this nasty looking brown, blackish color, almost I don't want to say it's crude oil, kind of, because I'll be honest with you, I've never seen pure crude oil, but it does have kind of an oily color to it. And I've mixed that down into an airbrush and then shot that again. Almost full strength. You're going to have to crank the air pressure up on your brush a lot to get it to come out, maybe even a bigger needle, depending on what you're shooting with acrylics. You always want to shoot with at least a medium needle. Another shot for airbrushing. I shoot with a tank of CO2 instead of an air compressor. CO2 means no hydrogen, no H, no H2O. So you have zero water in your line. It's a little expensive to get into it first because you've got to buy a different set of regulators. You've got to buy in the tank. Once you empty out the tank, and a tank will last a long, long time, as long as you remember to turn it off when you're done. You take the tank down. I buy mine at a welding supply. Go over there. It's a small little about 2 foot tall pony tank, and you give them $20 and they give you a charged one, and you give them the old empty one and you go home. But a tank, I've got one, I've been shooting on it for well over a year and still haven't emptied it out yet. In fact, I've used only about a fourth of it so far. Now, I've not done a ton of modeling this year, but again, crank the air pressure up, shoot that out. You want it, and you want to get up above the model by quite a bit, a couple of feet, and shoot down onto it so that the paint is almost dry when it lands.
Okay. Nice. Our other resident weathering guru, Ralph, has asked, where can he find more pictures of your work?
I've got a few out there online. The website that was at the bottom of all the pages is very sadly out of date. I mean, when I say sadly, I don't think I've updated it in a decade. I've got a whole bunch of stuff I need to put out there. North Texas Narrow Gauge Group, ntxng.com, has some building phases, structures of our layout. I had a few pictures of it there in the slide deck. That's our entire group's work. There's a set of buildings that's on the right-hand edge of the layout. I built most of those structures, not the engine house. That was a friend of mine named Charlie Kirk, another master model railroader here in the area. But the other structures on that end I did. There's a number of photographs out on Purgatory and DevilRiver.com that I hope to get updated in the next coming months. But that's where the bulk of it will be.
Okay. I see there's one question over in YouTube from David asking, is there going to be a print copy of this clinic available?
If this clinic is still not available on LoneStarRegion.com, that is our LSR's website. If that's not still available out there, I will get with our webmaster. He's a good friend of mine, and I will make sure he gets a copy of that and gets it posted. In fact, the clinic version that's online has another section to it that I didn't cover. I cut an entire section out of it for time, talking about different supplies, so different materials and things. So if it's not up there, I will update a few things on it, and I will get it to Jeff, and we'll get that uploaded. Again, LoneStarRegion.com. It'll be in a clinic section. A lot of good clinics out there.
Great. How about you, Martin? Anything that you can see over there in the chat?
Yeah. Yeah, that yeah, one spot on the wall is a little flatter than the rest. Yeah, it's that's a very important note, and I should have mentioned that. Yeah, you definitely do not want hot water because that is a mistake you will only make once. It is stunning how many things we learn the hard way in this hobby, and that's the ones that always stick with you the best, unfortunately. But yes, warm water, not hot. But it helps warm the chemicals up. It helps it flow better out of the can. Again, I really like Tamiya, however you want to pronounce it. I really like that one, and I think a lot of it just gets down to more of the tip that's on the can than it is. I'm not a big fan of the one that's on testers cans these days. For the longest time, I was saving the old tips and cleaning them out and putting them on the new cans, and I've run out of those now, so now I'm buying the other brand. But Vallejo, mix it up, throw it out of your airbrush, works really, really nice. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. Yes, and I just got those a couple of weeks ago. And in fact, I was looking around to see if I could hold up the box. They've got several different smaller sets, and you can get those on Amazon and different places. Here in the States, the bigger box set that has all 37 colors, I think it is, that box set's a little hard to find. I actually just ordered mine straight from AK Interactive online, and they ship from Spain, I think it is. But I ordered mine on a Sunday evening, and Wednesday, DHL dropped it off on my front porch. They work a lot like the Prismacolor pencils I've always used. So you can get them really fine tipped. You can get in between the edges of boards where they make a 90-degree. You can get into that crack there, But the ability to get them damp and then let that run and be able to blend them with your finger. They also will erase. If you get a little bit too much on there, you can take a pencil eraser, and the little white ones seem to work the best for that. And you can just rub them right off like you would anything else. But they're really, really nice. They come in a great set of colors. The whole set is geared for just weathering. So it's browns and rust colors and a few reds, a few oranges, things like that. And there's some metallics in there as well. So it's a really neat little set. I've had mine for about a month now, and I've been playing around with it, and I'm really, really happy with the effects.
Okay. I see there's a couple of comments. Do you have your mic on mute again, Martin?
Oh, there we go.
Yes, perfect.
Yep. I was on mute, so I was asking Duane here about the AK Interactive pencils, and that's why he started talking about AK Interactive pencils after a short silent burst. So I'll get used to hitting two buttons to talk soon.
There they are.
And he's found them.
Yeah, we won't hold it against you after this 60 hours of air travel that we've had.
Yep.
There, I just noticed Richard's got a question or a comment over in the Facebook chat. I noticed that in the background you have your paint rack storing all your paints horizontally. Any reason on that?
Yeah, because I found it and it would hold a lot of paint in the same spot. It swivels around. The more I've had it, the more I don't like it because it does swivel and it's longer than it is deep, so it actually eats up an awful lot of space. I will probably make a similar rack to what you see holding up all my Vallejo paints. Vallejo sells a rack that you can buy to store your paints in. I'm lucky enough to have a laser, so they gave me a picture. So at that point, I knew what to do. So I drew it up and cut my own out of a laser and out of acrylic. And I will probably make a similar stand for all of these. It has nothing to do with trying to keep the paint in a certain position or anything like that. It's what was available. So I will probably be changing that and go to a more tiered and verticals type storage at some point in the not too distant future.
Yeah, okay. Sounds good. Anything else that you can see in the chat that I've missed?
I'm just having a scan over it now, and I don't see if Gordy'd leave my mouse alone because he's now connected to the computer. I'm just having a look through the chat. No, I think we covered most bases there. So, and I've remembered to turn my mic on, so that's a bonus.
So it's all good.
If anybody has any other questions, the link that was at the bottom of all the slides, there's a contact us link on that website, and that will reach out to me and my father, Paul Richardson MMR. He was the former national AP chairman. it'll reach out to either one of us, and one of us will get back to you with an answer of some sort. And I will make a quick plug for the achievement program. It will make you a better modeler. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. I'll get you in contact with your regional guy. I'll answer any questions that you have. But again, I guarantee it will be the best thing you do for your hobby. Get involved in the achievement program.
No problem. Well, I think that's it. We'd like to thank you very much, Duane, for your time and
Thank you for
and coming on here. And I think we'll be getting you back to do some more. Looks like somebody's pleased to be somewhere.
My dog just saw a squirrel, so.
Okay, so I'll hit the button here, and we shall be back in a couple of seconds with a few public service announcements, I'd say.
Thanks all.